This episode is brought to you by the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, which embodies the value-based approach to philanthropy and business of its chairman, Arthur M. Blank. To learn more, head to blankfoundation.org. Thank you. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guests today are McTee and Vince Slabe. Mike and Vince are Montana-based researchers who use cutting-edge science, writing, and educational programs to protect eagles in the American West and beyond. Both Mike and Vince are laser-focused on the surprisingly little-known issue of lead poisoning in bald and golden eagles, an issue mostly caused by eagles scavenging the remains of big game animals that have been hunted with lead-based ammunition. For example, a study conducted near Jackson, Wyoming, captured migrating golden eagles, tested them for lead, and found that 98% of them had elevated levels of lead in their blood. Committed hunters themselves, Mike and Vince are devoting their professional energies towards finding sustainable, reasonable, and mutually beneficial solutions to this large-scale challenge. Mike lives in Missoula and works as a researcher at the MPG Ranch, a large, privately owned ranch in the Bitterroot Valley that promotes conservation through restoration, research, education, and information sharing. He's also the author of the book Wilted Wings, A Hunter's Fight for Eagles, which was just recently published by Riverfeet Press. In it, Mike lays out the issue of lead poisoning in eagles in a compelling and easy-to-understand style, and he also offers some clear and relatively simple paths to solving the issue. He's also written for the FlyFish Journal, Backcountry Journal, and Bugle, and he's a sought-after speaker on various hunting-related topics. Vince is a Bozeman-based research wildlife biologist with Conservation Science Global. He holds a Ph.D. from West Virginia University and recently published a widely cited paper that details the implications of lead poisoning in eagles across North America. The paper, which was published in Science, describes how almost half of the bald and golden eagles sampled for the study had elevated levels of lead in their blood. More importantly, it explains exactly how increasing or decreasing levels of lead exposure will affect golden and bald eagle populations. We talk about the paper in our conversation, and I've also linked to it in the episode notes. This is a fascinating discussion that digs deep into a very specific issue, an issue that's largely under the radar here in the West. But if you zoom out from the details related to lead and eagles and focus on the big picture, I think you'll agree that Mike and Vince are shining examples of the many smart, driven, level-headed people here in the West who are working hard to find win-win solutions to conservation-related challenges. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Mike's new book, and Vince's paper, and I hope you will too. Be sure to check out the episode notes for a list of all the topics we discuss and links to everything. Thanks for listening. First of all, thank you guys both so much for taking the time out of your schedule to join me. I'm so impressed with the work y'all are doing, and I hate it that I'm taking away an hour of your valuable time that you can be devoting to this research and important implementation you're doing. Thank you so much for your work and for taking the time. I was thinking maybe the best way to start, since it's three of us on the call, which is pretty cool for this podcast, because I do that every so often, but I always love it when I have the opportunity. But I would love it if we could start out with intros, just kind of an overview of who you are, what your area of expertise is, where you work, and then that'll also give the listener a chance to identify the name with the voice. So Mike, maybe if you can go first.
Well, first, I just have to say it's an honor being on this podcast. I only subscribe to 2 podcasts, and this is one of them.
Man, thank you.
So I grew up in Western Washington in a hunting family where I was flinging arrows in the backyard at about 4 years old, and eventually moved out to Western Montana, Missoula specifically, for my undergrad, where I studied environmental chemistry. And after earning that degree, I began working for MPG Ranch, which is a conservation ranch in the Bitterroot Valley. And for anybody listening who doesn't know what the Bitterroot Valley looks like, it's absolutely gorgeous with rolling grasslands on the Sapphire side to the east that rise to conifer forests. And on the west, big craggy peaks that spill into the Bitterroot Selway Wilderness. And so after earning my undergrad, I began studying trap and skeet and sporting clay range and the contamination associated with that, and earned a master's in geosciences, basically studying the geochemistry of that site. And now it's really moved on to eagles and lead poisoning, which we'll get into a lot more.
That's awesome. And then Vince, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Ed, for having me on. This is an honor to be on your podcast, and to think that people want to hear about what I want to say is it's hard to wrap my head around. But
Same.
But anyway, I'm originally from Illinois. I grew up in the central Illinois cornfields. In my early years, I would seek out little patches of riparian forest to go for hikes and learn about, the animals in that forest and the birds and things like that. And it led me to embark on a degree in park and natural resource management for my undergraduate. And after I finished that, I tacked on a master's degree in the same field at the University of Illinois. And as soon as I finished it, I couldn't get out west fast enough. I'd spent a lot of time reading about the mountains and reading about the vast expanse of the American West. And it was very romantic for me. And as soon as I could, I packed up my 1990 Jeep Cherokee and started driving out west. And I ended up in multiple places. Originally, I was in Jackson, Wyoming for a while. I lived in Montana. I lived in Oregon. I lived in Northern California. But what I started doing was doing bird research. And I really got into just learning about birds. And it wasn't long until I met a guy named Rob Dominich in Missoula. And it's a guy that both Mike and I have worked with a lot in the past. And Rob introduced me to eagles. And that was it. After that, I knew I wanted to study eagles for the rest of my life. And so about 7 years ago, I applied for a PhD program at West Virginia University, ended up getting my PhD studying lead poisoning in eagles. And shortly after that, I moved back to Montana. The culmination of my research was recently published. And the published article basically discusses lead poisoning of both bald and golden eagles at a nationwide scale. And now, basically, here we are today.
And what's the name of that was just published? Because I know it got a lot of press, and I'll want to link to it in the episode notes.
Sure. Demographic implications of lead poisoning for eagles across North America. And it was published in the journal Science in February.
That's awesome. And people can also just Google your name, and there's a bunch of articles about it. So that's
sure,
pretty cool. I was thinking we'll just kind of go back and forth between both of us, and I've kind of got questions directed for each of you, but feel free to chime in, either one of you. Mike, I love your new book. Mike's got a new book out called Wilted Wings that's coming out in early September, and this episode will probably be published right around the time of that publication. It's an awesome book. It gave me a really deep appreciation for raptors in general and bald eagles and golden eagles. Mike, I was wondering if we could start out with you just kind of laying the groundwork about the history of raptors in the United States, because that was something I didn't fully appreciate. But as I was reading your book, there's so much. Raptors kind of follow the same history as like the bison that were just kind of wiped out, or probably a more accurate comparison is the wolf. They were kind of purposefully tried to be wiped off the map, and they went from this, like bald eagles, from this massive population down to a few hundred, which I just didn't know anything about, and now I do. And it's so it makes everything so much richer when you're thinking about this particular subject. Can you just give kind of a brief overview of raptor-human interaction over the last 200 years?
So right now there are about 300,000 plus bald eagles in the United States. So they're flying all over the place. They burst from lots of cottonwood forests that I know, but it hasn't always been like that. So if we rewind to when the Europeans began settling across the lower 48, there was a lot of habitat destruction, the draining of wetlands, and bald eagles, they rely on aquatic species, whether it's waterfowl, whether it's fish. So if you're taking away the habitat for those species, bald eagles can in turn lose habitat. And people have loved to shoot bald eagles for a long time. And that eventually invoked I think it was in 1940, the Bald Eagle Protection Act. So their numbers had really plummeted. And then in the 60s, their numbers were down to roughly 500 breeding pairs in the lower 48. So just a disaster.
That's crazy.
Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, comes out and it discusses like, hey, there's this chemical called DDT. It kills mosquitoes and some other insects, but it's ultimately weakening the eggshells of bald eagles and many other birds. Peregrine falcons nearly went extinct. So then DDT began getting phased out. And that was really around the time when bald eagles started their slow and then dramatic recovery. And it wasn't just the banning of DDT that did it. It was other restorative efforts, like making sure people don't shoot them.
Yeah.
Having some super serious fines associated with that in case people do that. And then with golden eagles, that's even trickier because they can prey on livestock like sheep.
Yeah.
So if somebody owns a farm and they see a golden eagle that's about to prey on their lambs, maybe they'll shoot it. And there's a Time magazine where they actually on the cover had a photo of a guy in a helicopter aiming down the barrel of a shotgun about to blast an eagle from the sky.
Wow.
So there was a widespread slaughter of eagles at that time. But now golden eagles are incorporated in the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And it's not just bald and golden eagles that have been persecuted. Like you brought up, raptors as well. Over on Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania, which is a birding mecca hotspot for raptor migration, there was actually a widespread slaughter of raptors there as well. A bounty was placed on goshawks because they could prey on game birds like grouse.
Wow.
Vince, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think you covered it really well, Mike. You know, one of the things that we can add to it is you mentioned, bald eagles population is over 300,000, and that population has been growing exponentially, as Mike stated. And there's been years recently where the population has increased up to 10% per year. And if you think about that, and you think about where the population was when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, it's a major success story for that species and the rebound that it has made. There are states that haven't had detections of bald eagles for almost a millennia, and now those states have lots of bald eagles. One example of that is the state of Iowa. Several years ago, they didn't have any nesting pairs in Iowa. About 15 or 20 years ago, they didn't have one nesting pair in Iowa. And through some research that's been done specifically by the organization I work for, Conservation Science Global, it's now come on their radar to study bald eagles in Iowa in conjunction with wind development in Iowa. But now, in a place where there was no nesting bald eagles, now they have documented nesting in every single county of the state.
Wow.
And so that's a good example of what's been happening with the bald eagle population in places like the Midwest, where it was very rare to see one. Growing up in central Illinois, I never once saw a bald eagle. I'd have to go to northern Wisconsin or Minnesota or to the Mississippi River out of state to see one. And now there's bald eagles all over central Illinois. Conversely, Mike also touched on the golden eagle. We've got a population, there's different estimates, but it's somewhere between 40 and 60,000 individuals in the lower 48 states. And so you're talking about a population of birds that's, roughly 10% that of bald eagles. Yep. And that you have a stable population. So with golden eagles, we're seeing a very stable population. In the last several years, the population hasn't grown and it hasn't decreased either, in contrast to the almost exponentially growing bald eagle population.
Interesting. No, that was a great summary. And I just thought it was important to really lay the groundwork because I'm pretty plugged into this world. And Mike, as I was reading your book, a lot of that information was new to me. I mean, it kind of linked it all together, like with the Silent Spring and the bald eagle protection and all that. So I think that's a great kind of launching point into what you guys spend most of your days doing now, which is trying to figure out how to prevent lead from doing the damage that it can do. Can you guys, and either one is fine, kind of give us an overview of this lead problem and just high level, and then we'll dig down into it a little bit. As DDT was curbed and as these populations are either stabilized or growing, there is this kind of silent killer out there that is really messing things up in a bad way. Either whoever wants to go on that, I'd love to hear just kind of an overview.
In Mike's new book, he really summarizes the history of this very well. So I'm gonna let him jump in on this one, and then maybe I'll add a couple of things. If
that's great. Yeah,
that's all right.
Yeah. I'll rewind pretty far. So there's a guy named George Bird Grinnell who, have you counted, Ed, how many times he's popped up on this podcast?
A lot.
A prominent conservationist in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He helped found the Boone and Crockett Club with Theodore Roosevelt. He was quite the writer too. He wrote for Forest and Stream, which later became Field and Stream. And in 1894, he wrote about how lead pellets can poison waterfowl. So we're talking over 100 years ago.
Yep.
And the deal going on with that is a waterfowl hunter or an upland hunter uses lead shot, and that shot sprays out of a gun barrel, and there can be hundreds of pellets potentially. And let's say a hunter shoots 10 rounds or more in a single outing. So that could be thousands of pellets on the ground. And birds, particularly like ducks, grouse, but Grinnell was talking about waterfowl mainly. They'll pick up grit that goes into their gizzard, which is this muscular organ that will help grind their food. Mm-hmm. And the grit in the gizzard helps grind seeds and things like that. And they can mistake the lead shot for grit, or they might mistake the lead shot as a seed or something like that. And as few as 4 or 5 lead shot can kill a mallard. So it doesn't take that much. It can actually be less than that, but 4 or 5 is definitely lethal. So that was over a century ago, and ducks just kept dying over the next few decades. And eventually it was in the 50s and 60s when there had been a lot of restorative efforts for waterfowl with the improvement of wetlands that ducks started doing a lot better, but there were also more hunters spreading lead on the landscape that the ducks could then ingest. And ultimately there was like a 2 to 3% mortality rate from these lead pellets per year.
Oh, wow.
On ducks. And then eventually there was I don't want to get into the full history, but
no, it's my podcast. I want to hear it. Just keep going.
No, Ed, I figured this would come up, and I actually reread that chapter this morning in the book because there's so many little nuances.
Yeah.
So basically, a lot of people wanted non-toxic shot so that the waterfowl wouldn't be poisoned by lead. And then there was animosity related to that because steel shot, for instance, can be harder on your teeth. So lead is pretty soft. You can bite into it, maybe not break a tooth. Steel shot, not so much. You can lose some teeth. There are worries about crippling loss, meaning if you shoot a duck with steel, does it just keep flying because it doesn't pack the same wallop as lead? But then there were instances where researchers found there was no difference. And even today, I would say some people argue about the differences between lead and steel, although many hunters are using bismuth and some other metals. But going back to the non-toxic, the phase out of lead, it was a contentious deal where some national wildlife refuges began requiring it. But ultimately, what happened was the National Wildlife Federation pressured the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to ban lead. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, over a few years, initiated a phase-out plan, and it was banned in 1991. But the interesting thing about that whole thing is it wasn't only the ducks that were being poisoned. It was bald eagles. And that is what drove the acceleration to the phase out, because we talked about DDT and bald eagle numbers being super low, like 500 nesting pairs. They started dying from lead. So back in the, I think it was the 60s or 70s, that's when biologists started realizing bald eagles were dying from lead. And what they were doing was picking up waterfowl that were either wounded or killed and unrecovered by lead shot, and then scavenging those or eating those. And because the bald eagle was protected under the Bald Eagle Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, and Vince, if I'm right, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that gave the Fish and Wildlife Service huge authority to be like, okay, this is happening. Mm-hmm. And then in 1991, it happened. So it was almost a full century after George Burt Grinnell wrote about it in Forest and Stream that it became banned. And now bald eagles are still dying, which gets us to where we are now with a lot of work that Vince and me are doing. So Vince and I are looking a lot at bullets now. Nice. So shot comes out of a shotgun, and then bullets come out of the rifle, and we're talking about single projectiles that travel fast, like 2,000-3,000 feet per second, sometimes faster. And a lead bullet is soft. It might have copper on the outside, but that core is soft. And when it travels at this incredible supersonic speed and hits an animal at that speed, pieces of lead can fly off of that bullet, and it can be hundreds of pieces. Mm-hmm. And I've shot into water, and I've measured how much mass a bullet might retain, and it can be 97% lead bullet, but that's really rare. It's usually 60, sometimes less.
60?
Yeah, so 40% of a lead bullet might be spread all over the inside of an animal. So then if a hunter guts that animal and leaves the innards, like the stomach and the intestine and lungs, the stuff that they're usually aiming for, mainly the heart and lungs, those residual lead pieces can stick around on the landscape where scavengers are going to eat it and potentially consume lead.
Your book does such a good job describing it, but I had my first big game hunting experience, in the winter in western Colorado, and shot a cow elk, and we gutted it and did everything and left, and there was this massive pile of guts. I mean, I couldn't believe how big it was. Couldn't believe how big the elk's stomach was, full of grass. That was one of the main things that stuck out, and it gave me an appreciation for what those animals could do to a rancher's operation if how much grass they eat, probably, and that was probably 6 hours worth. But anyway, this massive pile of guts, and we left and came back the next day, and there was nothing there but the pile of grass. And so it was raptors, it was coyotes, all these different animals. And so that was one of the more memorable parts of my hunt, is seeing how quickly that happened. And it gave me a more of an appreciation for what we're talking about today. Vince, anything you want to add to that?
I was just going to add, from the bald eagle perspective, in the early 80s, it was pretty evident that not only waterfowl was being poisoned, but also the bald eagle. And a group of researchers did a dosing study in the early 80s where they actually had captive bald eagles and were feeding them lead pellets. So that was the moment where they proved that lead was very detrimental to a bird like a bald eagle. And the effects ranged from the bird was affected, could not fly, the bird couldn't eat, or the bird just outright died. And they had variable amounts of pellets that they would feed to the bald eagle and basically force them to ingest it. But the bottom line was they saw a lot of symptoms in these birds. Basically, they were able to document that this lead was affecting every single system of their body, and doing it in a very, ugly way, because they were actually able to watch the birds as they were becoming dosed. So that led to the law that Mike just talked about with waterfowl, and they outlawed the use of lead for waterfowl hunting. And at that time, bald eagles were being admitted at rehab facilities, at a pretty high rate. And the assumption was these eagles were eating wounded or dead waterfowl that had been shot with lead shot. Mm-hmm. And, at that time, this idea, this story you just told of a gut pile and an eagle, and that being a preferred food source, was not really on the radar of the Fish and Wildlife Service or raptor researchers in general. And so now fast forward 10 years, this law has been in place hunters are using, for the most part, steel shot unless they're breaking the law for waterfowl hunting. But bald eagles are still being admitted at these rehabilitation facilities. They're still showing up lead poisoned. The samples that researchers are collecting, the bald eagles seem to be being poisoned at very similar rates than before the passage of this law. And so then that led researchers into looking at alternative ways that these birds could be getting poisoned. And, with Mike and I's research, there was a landmark study by the Peregrine Fund. Basically what they did is they took a portable x-ray device and they x-rayed whole animals, ungulates, deer, that had been shot with lead ammo. And they also x-rayed gut piles of deer that had been shot with lead ammo. And they found a fragment in 100% of their samples.
Yeah.
So now the focus, as far as the history goes, there's no lead in waterfowl hunting. What's going on? The focus now shifts to big game hunting.
Mm-hmm. So I would guess, I'm not all that smart, but it seems like the waterfowl situation with lead could be classified, unless you're just way out there, that's a success. That is a successful way. Absolutely. They use education, legislation to have a positive outcome. So now we're kind of at this crossroads, thanks to the work of you two guys and a bunch of other really smart people, where this new issue has come to the forefront with the gut piles and the lead and how that is affecting it. So this is where we talk about all the cool stuff y'all are doing. How do we solve the problem? Like, how do we fix this? What are you guys doing? And maybe Mike, we start with you, because I love the educational component, the communication component, the spreading the word component. I feel like that anytime you're going to make a big change, that is a mandatory part. So can you talk a little bit about the work you're doing on this specific challenge?
Yeah, you bet. I do have to just say that this issue, it's more pervasive than I ever thought.
Really?
So, yeah, when I started working at MPG Ranch, Raptor Research Institute, led by Rob Dominich, who we mentioned earlier, he was catching golden and bald eagles in the winter. And I remember just listening to him talk about how nearly all of these eagles had been exposed to lead. And I'm like, that's too bad. And I kind of didn't really think it was from something I might be doing, and I didn't think it was actually all of them. But we recently published a study that went nearly a decade, and we found that about 95% of the golden eagles had been exposed to some amount of lead. We're catching these in the winter when golden eagles are scavenging readily. And it's shocking to think that nearly all of them had been exposed. And of the 5 eagles that hadn't been exposed, that didn't have elevated concentrations, 4 were in their first year of life. Maybe they were just, so young they hadn't had the opportunity to scavenge lead.
Yeah.
And that was really powerful to me. So when I graduated with my master's degree, I started working a bit more with Rob, and doing my own ballistic research and doing research on lead poisoning. And it was surprising to me how little I was reading about this in hunting magazines. So I didn't know if hunting magazines were avoiding it or whether the editors were unaware of the issue, which I don't think they are. I now know plenty of editors at hunting magazines who embrace this issue. But I just started writing about it and trying to raise as much awareness as possible, particularly in Montana, just starting small. And so it might be an online piece. It might be op-eds. So one was in the Billings Gazette, another one was in the Missoulian, just trying to raise awareness. And then on social media, we would do posts about what we're finding. We would talk about the rehabilitators who ultimately receive eagles that almost always have some amount of lead in their blood. And Ed, have you ever seen an eagle that's suffering from lead poisoning, maybe even a video?
No, but that's what it was just in my head. I think you read my mind, is that at your book, especially like the first chapter, is this, and throughout the book are these descriptions of what it's like to see an eagle that is suffering from lead poisoning. And it's just awful. It just sounds, I don't know if I don't want to watch a YouTube video about it because it just seems so awful.
It's haunting. It's really haunting. So these eagles that they're catching where I work, if they put GPS transmitters on them, about 1/3 will hang around Western Montana or just the general area in the Rocky Mountains, the Northern Rockies. But 2/3 will migrate to these far-flung places like the Yukon, the Seward Peninsula in Alaska, the Arctic Circle. But then you go to a rehab facility and you see a golden eagle that could maybe once attack a pronghorn. It had that much power, but now it's in an infant's crib with its wings draped to the floor, and it's emitting just this delicate chirp. And its eyes, I always recommend people, if they can see a raptor up close, do it and look into a raptor's eyes and just see where that takes you in your imagination. There's just this fire burning in there. And when you see that fire in an animal that can barely hold its head up, it sticks with you and you feel a lot of compassion for it. It really makes you want to fight for their health.
Sure.
But, going back to all the writing and the writing specifically, it ultimately led to this book of just trying to get folks engaged with this issue so that they have the information. And I think we should also talk about shooting demonstrations. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, please do.
We did
I
one.
love that.
We did one in June, and this is something that a lot of non-lead advocates have been doing for over a decade. But Vince, you want to take that away?
Sure. The shooting demonstration was something that I was originally exposed to from Chris Parrish, who is the head of the Peregrine Fund.
Yeah.
And Chris Parrish is kind of I look up to him a lot. He's definitely inspired me a lot in my research and in my outreach and in the way that I feel about this issue. But Chris, invited me to come along on a demonstration he was doing here in Montana. And I was just a fly on the wall, and just watching that, the demonstration consists of shooting lead and shooting non-lead rounds. And to see firsthand the differences in the fragmentation, whether, Chris was shooting into a water barrel, and the water barrel collects everything that comes off of that bullet, off of that round. And so to be able to see the fragmentation rate of a common caliber rifle and to just see it firsthand right in front of you, from the point of the round gets loaded into the gun, it gets fired, you walk up to it, and just to hear Chris discuss it. And on top of that, you're able to see the accuracy to a certain extent. You're seeing that the bullet is performing. If we get into ballistics and the things like that, Mike's going to jump in because I'm not the best when it comes to that type of stuff. But from a guy like me who hunts, I wouldn't call myself an avid hunter, but I do manage to fill a tag every now and then, deer or an antelope tag. And someone who has switched from lead to non-lead over 10 years ago. It is something I did immediately the first time I saw or heard about raptors being poisoned or having the chance of being poisoned. But just from a perspective of an average hunter like myself, to witness that demonstration was huge. And so, recently I was able to apply for and secure some funding here in Montana from AMB West. It's the Arthur and Blank Foundation. It's their Western affiliate out here, and they're located south of Livingston in the Paradise Valley, where they have purchased a handful of ranches. And part of their efforts in the purchase of these ranches is to open them up to a certain extent to local folks here in this part of Montana. And one of the programs they have going at the Paradise Valley Ranch is really awesome. It is a guided hunt program. So about this time of year, the hunt manager at Paradise Valley Ranch, Terrence Eichhorn, opens up a lottery. And last year, I think they got like 1,000 or 1,200 applicants, and they give out about 200 cow tags and a couple of bull tags.
Okay.
So from those 1,200 applicants, they select 200 some hunters. And those hunters are then provided with a guided hunt to harvest their animal. So Terrence and his staff of expert hunting guides, they meet you in the morning and you go out hunting for the day. And they really like to select those folks that are looking to fill a freezer and looking to do it in a little bit potentially easier way than it might be to hunt on public land. There's a lot of debate on how tough it is to hunt on public land these days as compared to some places of private land. 2 years ago, they decided they were going to require the use of non-lead ammunition. I started communicating with the grant manager, at AMB West Peter Brown. And Peter Brown was familiar with a lot of the recent research that had come out that had suggested that lead could be a source of mortality for eagles. The Paradise Valley in Montana is a very important place for eagles. A lot of nesting golden eagles in the Paradise Valley, along with an influx of wintering golden eagles. Yep. And wintering bald eagles and nesting bald eagles. So both species, lots of presence of those species. And they knew just from the little bit of time they were on the ranch that there were a lot of eagles around. And so they decided to require non-lead ammunition. And I participated with them in helping them form some verbiage on the website. Fast forward a year, I put in a grant, and the grant is to offset the cost of non-lead ammunition, not only for the hunters that are going to be coming to their property, but hunters in this part of Montana. And part of that grant was also, we wanted to put on some demonstrations to show folks, to talk about why this issue is happening, why the ranch is requiring non-lead ammunition. And, not only did we want to offset the cost of that ammo, but we also wanted to, provide some information, talk to hunters about this and put the word out about why the ranch is doing this and why this might be a good idea to think about switching to non-lead ammo. And so Mike, being much more educated on the ballistics of ammunition used in common big game calibers, Mike, having done multiple demonstrations in the past that I wasn't able to be a part of, but knew about, I immediately reached out to him when we were provided funding to do an ammo demonstration. And Mike was generous enough to drive over from Missoula and basically put on the demonstration for me. I was lucky enough to attend and be a part of talking about it, things like that. But Mike put that on, and that's one aspect of the grant that we got from Arthur Blank. But the other aspect is this $20 off a box of ammo. Mm-hmm. And so we're offering that $20 off to up to 1,200 hunters in this part of Montana. We got a 3 or 4 county area that we're targeting, and we have 4 ammo stores that are collaborating with us and honoring the vouchers. And so right now we're just trying to one, get the vouchers into hunters' hands, and 2, a whole other podcast, but battle the ongoing ammo shortage that is happening right now. And so
I love that. And I love, we were all introduced by the Blank Foundation, and people who listen to this podcast are familiar with the Blank Foundation. And it's just, they seem to be so forward looking, and they seem to be willing to go 1 or 2 steps ahead of what kind of the status quo is on all these Western issues. It's really inspiring. One specific question, Vince. People listening, I can't really tell where people who listen to the podcast are, but I can tell website traffic, and Southwest Montana is probably the most people that come to my website. So anybody who's hunting that wants to get one of these vouchers, how do they do it?
Yes, please go to montanahuntersforeagleconservation.org. Okay. And there's a little tab on there that says Get Ammo. And basically what it's going to do is ask you for a little bit of information. It's going to ask you to agree to a follow-up question. I'm just going to reach back out to you if you're able to acquire ammo and get a voucher and get $20 off a box at one of the participating retailers. We're just going to reach back out to you and ask to see what you thought about the ammo, and most importantly, if you use the ammo to harvest an animal. Because my primary interest in all of this, is as a researcher, as someone that's as a raptor researcher, my current, focus is to test whether or not the use of non-lead ammunition reduces mortality of species like bald and golden eagles. Yep. And in order for me to test that as a researcher, I'm going to need to reach back out to participants in our programs to see whether or not they were able to harvest an animal. Because then we can start saying, okay, there's this many gut piles out on the landscape in Southwest Montana. And a program like this effectively made X amount of those gut piles lead-free, and therefore safe for scavenging animals like eagles.
So here's a question for either of you. Pretty basic question again, and we're dealing with my basic brain, so that's the kind of questions I ask. I mean, the science seems pretty clear that I mean, it's clear that lead is awful for a wide variety of reasons, specifically for this conversation for eagles. The ballistics from reading about it seems that the ballistics are right on, for non-lead ammunition is just as effective as lead. And so why don't people just change? I mean, cost, I guess, is a issue right now, which that would be changed, I would guess, as the supply of non-lead ammo became the norm. But what are you guys hearing as far as what's the pushback? Why wouldn't this just change tomorrow? I know human nature is what it is, and people don't like to change. But can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, I'll introduce it, and then I'll let Mike jump in. It's a very tough issue. First of all, what I'd like to say is that this issue is widely not known about. So, I like to communicate with hunters as much as I can. And, it's why I've developed some research projects that are communicating with hunters. And the more that I do this, the more that I realize that the majority of the hunting population is not aware of this issue, is not aware of the fragmentation rates of big game, of ammo commonly used for big game hunting, not aware that gut piles left behind are potentially poisoning these birds. And so above all, it's just a conversation. Mm-hmm. We just want to talk about it and talk about it from the perspective of a pro hunter perspective. As a hunter myself, I know that hunters are some of the premier conservationists in this country.
I agree.
And so more times than not, when they learn about this issue, they start thinking, their mind starts turning like, okay, well, maybe I should potentially consider using non-lead ammo. I could see the benefit to that. And so the more that we communicate this issue, the more that people will know about it, and the more that we could potentially see a switch, from lead to non-lead ammo. The problem is when, a message like ours is misinterpreted as anti-hunting.
Yes.
Or as okay, well, maybe I shouldn't hunt at all. That is the last thing that myself is trying to encourage. Mm-hmm. I am very familiar with not only the ethic of most hunters and the conservation mindedness of most hunters, but I'm also familiar with the amount of money that is spent on hunting in this country and the amount of taxation that ends up going into conservation. We have the Pittman-Robertson Act. I think last year, taxation from the Pittman-Robertson Act was over $1 billion. And that money is then divided from the federal government and divided amongst the states. That money is used to fund the salaries of wildlife biologists. It's used to fund the acquisition of wetlands for waterfowl habitat. Money is used to acquire access locations for hunting and fishing. I can go on and on. It is very, very important that we not only maintain the hunting population that we have, but I will do anything I can personally to increase the amount of hunters out on the landscape. And so that's the problem, is we want to make sure that this message comes across, in the right way and not in a negative way. And so moving forward, someone like me, a researcher, I've spent a lot of time documenting the presence of lead in species like eagles. And then I write about it, and then it gets peer reviewed, and then that disappears in an academic journal that's not made available to a lot of the hunting public and a lot of the public in general. A lot of academics read it. And what I'm practicing now is going from spending 10 to 15 years documenting this problem scientifically, academically, to now my effort to do something about it. And my effort to do something about it is essentially either buying hunters' ammunition or offsetting the cost of ammunition for hunters, and then asking those hunters if they would be available to me to ask them if they were able to use the ammo in a successful way. And when it comes to outreach and when it comes to learning to be this next phase of my career, that's why I team up with people like Mike McTee, who is already a seasoned person at outreach on this subject, and an avid hunter, and someone that's doing research into the ballistics and everything. And so Mike will have a little bit of a different, perspective on all of this.
Yeah, and one thing before Mike goes is that I can't tell you how much I appreciate guys like y'all, because the hardcore scientific research and the data and the science, that is so important and so invaluable. But like you said, Vince, a lot of times that stuff just stays in the halls of academia and nobody ever sees it. Mm-hmm. And it's still important at that point, but I think it's almost like it gets supercharged when you have guys like you, both of you, who know how to take that hardcore science and then translate it to people like me. It's like at engineering firms. There's always one guy that works there that his job is to translate the smart person stuff from the engineers to the client. And I feel like y'all are taking this very important information that may not ever, very well can never see the light of day, and you're blasting it out. And I think that is just so important. Sorry, Mike, go.
Oh, well, I think Vince is really nailing it with this voucher program. I'm super envious. I'd love to do something like that here in the Bitterroot Valley, where we actively catch eagles every winter, and we could potentially see their lead levels decrease over time. So maybe that's in the future. I hope it is, because that would feel really good. And on the topic of why doesn't everybody just shoot copper, I'll make an analogy. I don't know if it'll work. We'll see. When I was in high school, I found a pair of running shoes I really liked, Asics. And I've bought that pair of shoes nearly every single year since. I've given Asics a lot of money. Yeah. And if you're a hunter, you might find that ammunition when you're 20 years old and then shoot that when you're 70, because it works. You've seen it kill elk and deer and pronghorn. So why would you switch? Mm-hmm. I think that is just one of the hardest sells. People have a lot of momentum doing the things that they do in their everyday life. So I guess we just have to throw this info out there in the most compelling way. And it might take 7 or 8 exposures. I've been giving presentations to the Montana Master Hunter Program, which is essentially put on by One Montana. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of every presentation, I go, who has heard about this issue? Lead poisoning and raptors. And these days, it's actually most people are raising their hands. And it's the Master Hunter Program. So these are people who keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the hunting community. And I have had countless presentations where afterwards somebody's like, I knew this was an issue and I'm switching now. They just need a tipping point.
Yeah. And there's a great part in your book that I really appreciated, because I think there are a lot of people, I think the vast majority of hunters are like what you're talking about there. They're just unaware of the issue. I mean, because I see that across the whole conservation spectrum, like water. Water was a big part of what I did professionally. And you talk to a very smart person and they have no understanding of the water issue in the West. And they're very well-intentioned, smart, curious people. When you tell them, then they're like, oh, well, I need to do something about that. So I feel like that's the majority of people. But there's a great part in your book where you talk about you're at a presentation with a more experienced guy who's been doing it. It's kind of when you're in the early stages of doing presentations, and some guy stands up and he's hot angry about anybody trying to tell him he should be using other ammo other than lead, and he has a bag that he's trying to say it's not as accurate, and he's just an angry dude. And your colleague very skillfully disarms him and, hey, what's your name? Let's talk about this. I want to hear what you're saying. And then by the end of the event, the guy's calmed down and he's open to talk, and he's turns out to be a pretty nice guy, and he apologizes. And so I think that just goes back to the importance of these in-person, you in front of a physical group of people telling these stories and really just say, educating people and letting people know this is what we're doing. I mean, have you had any other experiences like that where somebody's angry and then once you're able to just have a nice conversation with them, they chill out and listen?
Most of my experiences are positive. Sometimes people disagree. They'll be like, I don't think they work as well. Mm-hmm. I'll be like, based on what information, which bullet do you shoot, which cartridge, and start asking questions like that. And sometimes people start stumbling. Other people know exactly what they shoot, and they're like, I'm standing by it. This bonded bullet works better than that copper bullet. Mm-hmm. But like Vince said, there have been a lot of studies looking at that. And I do have to say that these copper bullets in general, they were designed decades ago for premium performance. And they're not some weird thing. A lot of people shoot them. People who are really into guns know that Barnes bullets, for instance, usually shoot fantastically out of most guns, and they offer excellent penetration and everything you would want, where the bullet hits the animal and then these petals peel back like a banana, which increases the surface area, that mushrooming. And that creates more friction through the animal, more tissue damage, and it's just a lethal bullet. And now a lot of different manufacturers produce different copper bullets like Federal and Nosler and Hornady. So they're fairly ubiquitous at this point. You can purchase them online.
Yeah, I have had some conversations that have started contentiously. Particularly one of the programs we have going right now, and this is for you listeners in Southeast Wyoming, the Shirley Basin. We have a program going. If you go to just huntersforeagleconservation.org, you can see the hunt units and qualifying tags in the Shirley Basin that qualify for our ammo distribution program going on there. And in that program, we're buying 2 boxes of ammo for participating hunters. So we're just in the process of starting that program now, and have bought about $8,000 worth of ammo for hunters so far this year. But we first ran this program 2 years ago, and there was a couple of hunters who replied on our website and said, this program is very suspect. It seems like you're in the process of trying to pass legislation that would ban the use of lead ammunition. It seems like you're trying to dupe us into participating in something that we don't believe in. And I had 2 cases of that. In both of those cases, we reached out to those hunters with an email and said, number one, we have a very simple purpose of this program. We want to test if the use of non-lead ammunition reduces eagle mortality in the Shirley Basin, Wyoming. 2, we have zero interest in supporting legislation toward banning the use of lead ammunition. I'll go back to what I said earlier. This is a communication issue. Most of the hunters that we talk to are unaware of this issue. And so the more we can get the word out there, Mike has a newsletter he sends out a few times a year, Mike, is it every 3 months or
quarterly?
And his list is growing on that newsletter. That talks about, I'll let Mike mention what that talks about. That's a great form of outreach. These distribution programs we're running is a great form of outreach. But the bottom line is, you look into this movement that Mike and I are a part of. And, I'll go back to Chris Parrish. I consider him kind of the godfather of this movement. He's the head of the Peregrine Fund, but he's also the co-founder of the North American Non-Lead Partnership.
Yes. That was on my list. I was getting ready to ask about that.
Right. Yeah. Him and Leland Brown at the Oregon Zoo are kind of, 2 of the originators of this movement, and, there's also huntingwithnonlead.org. There's Mike's efforts at MPG. You have a recent organization that started out of Wyoming called Sporting Lead Free. All of these organizations are, in one way or another, there's some similarities and there's some dissimilarities. Some of them are focused on wildlife health and human health. Some of them, like the North American Non-Lead Partnership, is really focused on, working with agency partners and working with corporate partners in saying, hey, we agree the use of non-lead ammo is a benefit for wildlife. And if you go on their website, you can see a full list of I think it's nonleadpartnership.org.
Okay.
But if you check that out, you can see the full list of state agency partners and corporate partners that have joined on to support this message. But the bottom line is the similarity between all of these groups is that we do not support the passage of legislation on this issue. That's not even something we're thinking about. What we're thinking about is the communication of this issue in an effective way. And, at Conservation Science Global, our programs are focused on buying ammo for hunters or offsetting the cost of ammo for hunters, and then seeing if the use of that ammo is helping eagles, period. And so that's kind of really important to understand with all of these movements, is that it's something that we're focused on communication. And so the blowback has been folks that misread our message and think that it's going toward legislation.
Sure. It's kind of cool to think about, 20, 30, 40 years from now, to look back at this moment, because from my perspective, it seems like it's like a Rachel Carson moment where there's this very clear problem that unless you're kind of out there, everybody agrees it is not great. And there is a way to fix it. And you guys are leading the charge, along with all these other super smart people.
Let me quote Chris Parrish really quick.
Please do.
Because that last statement you made leads into it perfectly. Chris Parrish simply says, hunters are the solution to this problem. Mm-hmm. And that's the bottom line. And we are all recognizing that, and we are all doing our part in trying to reach hunters as conservationists with this message.
Mike, how do we sign up for your newsletter?
We'd have to put a link in your show notes.
All right, I'll link it in there. I'll have in the actual episode, like in the actual, when you look at your podcast players, I'll have a ton of links in there so people can just click through very quickly. They don't even have to go to the website. So I'll get that from you. I can't believe it, but I say this every time. People think I'm joking, but I don't look at a clock, and then I look down and it's like, oh my God, we're at an hour. And so in the spirit of trying to keep these things within around an hour, I would love to hear some books that you guys have read, because you guys are obviously a lot smarter than me, and I'm always looking for book recommendations from smart people. I've got a book recommendation. It's called Wilted Wings, A Hunter's Fight for Eagles by Mr. Mike McTee. So good. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy. It'll be on my reading recommendations list. Read that. Mike's too humble to promote it. But Mike, what are some other books I should be reading?
You're too nice, Ed. So if I was only going to recommend one book on this podcast, it doesn't necessarily pertain to the West, but One Long River of Song by Brian Doyle.
I've got it on my desk. Somebody gave it to me. A good buddy gave it to me. And then I saw in your book, you quoted or you referenced Doyle, and it reminded me that I need to read it. And so that's awesome, because I need to read it. Tell me about it.
Well, it's like being dipped in a vat of joy.
Really?
It's just, yeah, the way he writes is so full of energy, and he can take anything that's ordinary and make it profound, which as a writer, you're always trying to do. And it's incredibly difficult. And a lot of it just comes through his optimism and his wonder, his attention to detail. He has one essay about 9/11 of people jumping out of towers, and he finds love in it.
Wow.
So that's incredible. And for anybody who's interested in just sampling some of what he's written, the guy passed away a few years ago from a brain tumor, unfortunately. He wrote a lot for Orion magazine, and he has one essay in there called Their Irrepressible Innocence, about going to a kindergarten to be restored, essentially. One of his more famous essays is called Joyous Voladores. Mm-hmm. It's about hummingbirds, and that was published by, I think, American Scholar. Just about wilderness, hunting. I know Grizzly Ears has been plugged multiple times on this podcast, and for a long time, that was my favorite book. Indian Creek Chronicles by Pete Fromm is fun. Have you read that one, Ed?
No, I have not.
That's a good, quick read. My buddy gave it to me. He's like, you want to finish a book in 2 days? And Stephen Ranello's American Buffalo and The Scavenger's Guide, but also just generally about the West. Some books that got me thinking. There by Tommy Orange, which is about an indigenous community.
My wife just read that 2 weeks ago and loved it.
She loved it. Great. Mm-hmm. It's it might seem a little disjointed at first because it's braided with a lot of characters, but the way they come together and the challenges they face really, it changed my mind on a lot of things. And then Terry Tempest Williams, Refuge, and anything by Cormac McCarthy and Jim Harrison, which I think it's important to read Brian Doyle to offset Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I've tried to get into Cormac McCarthy over the years, and because everybody just loves him, and I like Blood Meridian, it started freaking me out, man. And then I'm scared. Somebody told me if I read The Road, I'm going to be in the depths of depression for 3 months. And he's like, but you still need to read it. And I was like, read that and then watch one of the videos of the eagles. That put me over the edge for about a year. Well, those are awesome. Vince, you got any for us?
My favorite books, what kind of really got me into the natural world and conservation and wanting to effectively, do that as my career were books by Hemingway, and some of his books, he's in Europe and he's fly fishing and he's on these streams and he's got some wine that he's drinking all day, and he's romanticizing being in these wild places and what it did for him. And then, I hate a Sand County Almanac. I'll never forget.
Yeah, you can't beat it.
I cannot put a value on that as far as my own trajectory in life. I mean, when I read that, again, the word romantic comes to mind. Just the way that the out of doors was romanticized before I got a chance to spend a lot of time in it. And so there are a lot of these, Thoreau, those were the early things I was reading in high school. And then, recently I've been thinking about kind of the message that was taken from all of these old writers and how they all kind of looked the same and maybe came from similar backgrounds. And so recently I've been reading more books from folks with diverse backgrounds. There's a professor, Drew Lanham.
Yeah, I've had him. Oh no, he wasn't on the podcast, but I interviewed him for a Parks and Wildlife event, and it's on my website. But he's awesome. I've read all his stuff. South Carolina guy. Yeah, I love that guy.
Yeah, really cool. He's done some really great talks that I've looked at online, and also I think his book is called The Home Place.
So good.
It really, I've read. I unfortunately haven't read the whole thing, but I've read a handful of chapters. I really love his reading. And then a woman named Carolyn Finney wrote a book called Black Faces, White Spaces, and just kind of that different outlook from a different perspective from someone of a different race of what the outdoors is like. And so those are kind of the things I've been doing and reading in my spare time. The best hunting book I've read, and there's two. One, Beyond Fair Chase. It was given to me by my hunting mentor, and I read it literally in like 30 minutes, 40 minutes. And as someone who was learning how to hunt in my early 20s, that book resonated with me. Like, this is the type of hunter I want to be. This is amazing. And it's a very short book, more of an essay than it is a book, but it was really hit me deeply. And then recently I read a book entitled Wilted Wings. From the perspective.
That's a good one. That's a really good one. I just read it too, and it is really good.
Absolutely. And just, the way that Mike is able to bring you with him on these hunts, describe not only, the pursuit of the animal, but what he's seeing around him as he's pursuing the animal, how he's feeling inside, how he's climbing this ridge, and he's and how his heart rate's going up, the habitat he's in, the animal he's after, and then the thrill of the harvest, and all of these things that you feel when you go hunting. It is a great book, everyone. It's really something that resonated with me, and it just made me want to drop everything and get out in the woods and go hunting right then.
And I agree with that. And then he also had the self-restraint that a lot of nonfiction authors do not have to keep it the length it's supposed to be. And it comes in at 143 pages, so you can enjoy it in one sitting versus sometimes when they fill up an extra 150 pages with fluff. It's just, you learn a lot, you're entertained. I learned a lot, and I like to, with this podcast and everything, I think people think I'm clued into every single issue, and I was not clued into this, but I am now. And it's, I really appreciate both of you guys. I just can't imagine how hard you guys work. And it's just, I told Vince this on the phone the other day, but you two guys could be doing anything you want to do. And you could be in New York City working at Goldman Sachs, trying to make companies merge with each other and get a cut of the deal. And instead you're applying your brain power to these important issues that make the world better. And, it really is just an honor to get to know you guys. It's really like a dream come true for me. I don't know why I get to talk to all these cool people. But last question for you guys. both of you have listened to the podcast. It's just for people who love the West from, at this point, literally all around the world, whether through hunting, conservation, ranching, writing, art, whatever. Do you have any kind of parting words of wisdom, any ask to make of the listeners, anything that you want to wrap it up with? Mike, you can go first.
Well, first, thanks for all that praise. I'm beyond grateful and about ready to weep here. I think I might have two recommendations, one related to what we've been talking about. And that's, if you're a hunter and you've been thinking about this issue, just go buy a box of copper bullets or copper ammo and give it a shot. I think you'll like how they perform. There are a lot of resources out there, like huntingwithnonlead.org. Just make it happen. And if you're a non-hunter and you know a hunter, maybe in your family or friend, just be like, hey, Carl, what bullet do you shoot?
Yep.
And just get that conversation going, and maybe refer them to this podcast or some of the references Vince laid out before. But as far as general wisdom, I received this when I was in college from a random professor, and it was spend less time online and more time reading books. And I figured that would be very fitting for this podcast.
I love that. And that's my philosophy. And now that I got kids, it's the philosophy at this point I'm forcing on them as well. So I think that's very wise. Vince, how about you?
My parting words are just how grateful I am to be provided a platform with your podcast, Ed, and the listeners of Mountain and Prairie, I feel like are the perfect audience for this message. And I'll just reiterate what Mike says and think about it. Think about this. Think about the use of non-lead ammo. Think about, as you walk away from that gut pile, think about not even thinking about it in a negative way, thinking about it in, I used an ammunition that was safe for any scavenging animal. Mike and I are pretty eagle-centric. We think a lot about eagles, but, there are a lot of animals that potentially are using that carcass and potentially, ingesting a fragment of lead in that carcass. So just by making a small switch to a safer ammunition, you can walk away as a hunter from that gut pile and field and be confident that you're providing a very important food source that is now safe because you chose to use an ammunition that is much safer to use in the field for wildlife.
Awesome. Guys, this was a real honor. I really appreciate it. Keep me in the loop about everything you're doing, because however I can help spread the word, even if it's just a few folks, whatever I can do to help, I work for you. Pro bono publicist. That's what I tell people. So keep up the good work. I'll look forward to meeting you both in person one day.
Thanks so much, Ed.
Thank you, Ed.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.